Good afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Geopolitics by Tyberius. And today we're going to be talking about Japan. It is the country spotlight, and it's going to be an interesting one. Roll the intro. All right, welcome back. It's good to see everybody, and I hope that you're doing this. We don't have a lot of people in chat right now, but number one, I just got done doing a review recording, so we just did a watch and remember. So if you ever want to chance to check out any of the movie reviews that I do, or any of the other content that I do, definitely go check that out on the rest of the channel if you're watching this on YouTube, which I assume you are. If you want, definitely follow me on Twitch to let you know when I'm live streaming if you want to drop by. And enjoy the chat and talk to people while this is going on. That'd be great. Because sooner or later, there's probably going to be more people that are watching, particularly with coming out later this week. We're going to have quite a lot of traffic is going to go to the YouTube channel. I guarantee it. And so we might break some records here coming up really shortly. But without further ado, today we're going to be talking about Japan and what's going on in the country spotlight. So, you guys know how this generally works. We'll be talking about the demography, the geography, the economics, the politics, and what have you. So, before we get into this, is there anything that I really want to make any kind of special notes on? The politics is going to be a problem for me because Shinzo Abe stepped down, and I don't really know who his replacement is. I haven't got a chance to really look into that. So, without further ado, let's talk about the geography. One of the things I'm really liking right now is that I'm not using the same maps as I was. So we're going to talk about the climate, we're going to talk about the geography, but I was using the ease of economic development maps that I had personally made, and I think the ones that I'm using now work a little better. So, first things first, talking about the climate. The climate is both really good and kind of bad all at the same time. The southern half of the islands, or let's just say the bottom part of the 2/3, are generally within the temperate zones of latitude, and so you get some pretty good weather. And if you actually get into the reality of this, is that when you get towards more of the southern islands, particularly around Okinawa, or anything just south of Kyushu, is that to a large degree you're getting into some tropical areas too. But in a general nutshell, is getting into the geography is that Japan itself is a little bit bigger than the islands of California, particularly Honshu. Or sorry, not the islands, but the state of California is about the size of Honshu, which is the big island. And if anyone does not know what the islands are, there are 4 main islands and thousands of mini islands, but the northernmost island, up there on the top, is Hokkaido. The main island is Honshu. The bottom island is Kyushu. And then there's the one that's kind of sandwiched between Kyushu and Honshu. I can never pronounce this one right. It's like Shikishima or something like that. And I apologize, but it's literally just kind of an extension of Honshu. There's multiple bridges to get on that island, and it now no longer functionally acts as its own independent island anymore. So getting into this, that is the 4 main islands. The climate's not terrible in a general sense, and if location-wise, it would actually be quite a wonderful place to build out a modern nation. But the geography could use some work. Now, this is a map that I wish I had a little bit more clarity in, but it illustrates the point that I like. Your green zones, you're relatively flat. You're not relatively flat, but you're relatively low elevations. Your dark zones are relatively high elevations. And anytime that you see a change in relative color, that means you're seeing a change in elevation. And many times that we have talked about, again and again and again, the thing you don't want to see very often within your geography is changes in elevation. So changing of colors is a bad thing. And particularly the more that you see of highlands and high ground means that you are not able to access the wider world nearly as easily as areas in the green. And boy, is Japan a bit of this problem. Let me switch views here for a second. So without getting into this, because I'll move back to this particular view here in just a second. The problem with, hey, thank you for the follow. The problem with Japan in a nutshell is how it formed. Largely, it's been formed by two processes. Number one is that there's a process that causes rifting, where if you have a Pacific or you have a ocean plate going under a continent, it will cause a welling to occur within the continental crust that it's running over, and it will eventually, in some regards, sometimes split it apart because of all the tectonic activity that's going on in the mantle. And what largely has happened is that Japan used to be part of Korea, of the Koreas and the western parts of Russia, but it's largely been literally pulled apart to where the Sea of Japan, well, technically part of the Eurasian plate, and Japan part of the Eurasian plate, is largely being pulled apart by literally running over the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific plate, and a lot of the more, it's a material, a lot of the more important materials that helps build out continental structures, and we're largely talking here about granite. A lot of that, when it gets melted down, still has a lot of its basic components, and so it will become igneous rocks, and it will well up into the bottom of the plate, and it will slowly help rift it apart. And that's part of it. Another part of it is just more of like a tensile force, to where you literally just have the continent here, and this is Asia right here, and this is the Pacific. It's dragging down this part here, and so it keeps pulling up, but then eventually when the earthquakes happen, it snaps back up again. Well, when it snaps up, is that this section here behind it kind of just gets pulled apart every time, because it's literally like I don't know how to put this. It's kind of like an accordion. It gets pushed together, and then when the pressure starts releasing, it rips itself apart. And that's kind of what Japan has been doing. The other part of the process is called island accretion, to where what Japan has functionally done since the Pangea started splitting apart is that Japan has basically become a scoop for anything that is in the Pacific that it can kind of, or sorry, that it'll scoop up. And so anything that isn't going to be on the subduction plate that is going down, anything that's like a mountain, or I'm sorry, not a mountain, anything that's going to be an island is going to get scooped up onto Japan and become part of the Japan proper itself. And it literally it doesn't go under, it goes and basically metabolizes onto Japan. And this is part of how this was formed for quite a while. Now, more this is the northern part of the islands. The southern part of the islands are kind of the remnant of the rift, and a little bit of the combination of like islands that used to be there used to be north of the Philippines that have been kind of rammed in. And it's really weird because in the plate tectonics, you're looking at a giant subduction zone right off the coast of Japan on the northern part, but also there's a southern part. But it's weird because it's a triangular plate. Let me see if I can bring that up real quick. That is not what I wanted. That is what I wanted. Okay, yeah, fantastic here. That is a weird looking thing. Let's see if I can get it. I think you guys can see this maybe just a little bit. It's relatively sizable enough. So right off the coast of Japan, you have the Pacific and the Eurasian plates meeting together. And, it's not too bad. But once you get right around Tokyo, and I think this map's drawn a little wrong, you get the Philippine plate, which is hilarious because the Philippines actually don't sit on the Philippine plate. But these areas are weird because it's the Philippine plate is going under the Eurasian plate, but the Pacific plate is going under the Philippine plate. And it's just one of these really weird deals to where you have a double subduction zone, so that you've got everything getting shoved over northern Japan as it eats the Pacific plate, but because you have the Philippine plate moving slower than the Pacific plate, is that the Pacific plate is going under the Philippine plate, and the Philippine plate is going under the Eurasian plate. And it's weird as hell, but it's a thing, and it happens. And so it's got a lot of weird geographic and tectonic activity here. But that's what you were largely talking about, is that, it separated off from Korea and China, which I thought about. And then this is the effects of a subduction zone. This is the other side of that. It's kind of a weird thing that goes on. But this largely explains why Japan looks the way it does, and we'll get back to this particular map. Why do you have an island? What do you have? What would basically be a rifting area off of the coast of Asia? All of a sudden, have massive changes in elevation that, quite honestly, should be absolutely worn down, because the geologic processes largely are pulling it apart and tearing it down. Well, two things. One, everything that's going under the mantle itself, or into the mantle from the Pacific Ocean plate, is going to have part of igneous processes that come back up. And this is the same thing that you see out in the state of Washington and the Cascade Mountain Range, is that everything under the Juan de Fuca plate is, getting shoved into North America, and it's bubbling back up into Mount Rainier and Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens and all that. And so a lot of volcanic activity. And Japan has a crap ton of volcanoes. The other side of that is that any of these islands that would be in the periphery, and eventually one day Hawaii will be this, is that it's going to get scooped up onto the edge of Japan. This probably won't be for another 100 million years or so, or at least another 60 million years, but eventually Hawaii is going to be next door neighbors, or maybe ends up becoming part of the Japanese archipelago. Very long time from now, but it will eventually happen. And of course, what the problem is that some of these continental drifts change relative to speed and direction. So maybe it'll go a completely different route. Don't know. But in a general note, is that Japan is largely formed by these two events: accretion of islands as they are basically scooped up by Eurasia onto Japan, and also by the welling of the separation. And if you can definitely tell here that this area is relatively mountainous in its regard. I do not know why it is mountainous in Korea and Russia. I'm going to assume that is a massive holdover from ages long past when Asia bumped into something else. And if you look at the map that we used to have there, it maybe is from when North America technically kind of slammed in to Eurasia the last time, and so that might be a remnant of that. But anyway, I want to step off of that particular part just to get back into Japan. Japan has a massive problem in its geography for two reasons. Number one is that it doesn't have a lot of natural resources, because it is basically a bunch of igneous rock and volcanic rock and a bunch of islands that have been scooped up there. And the problem is with most of those islands, they're igneous and volcanic as well. And so outside of one or two areas that were largely the leftover crust and continental debris of Eurasia, Japan is largely resource deprived. Sorry, switching back. Yeah, Japan's largely resource deprived. It doesn't have a lot. It doesn't have a lot of oil. It doesn't have a lot of iron. It doesn't have a lot of anything. And they have to import most of their raw commodities and raw materials. It's not to say that they don't have any. They're just saying they don't have a lot. They do have some iron in some key areas. There's a reason why Japanese swords the katanas are as awesome as they are. But in a general sense here, this is a place that has to operate in a completely different mode and level than what we've had to see with the rest of the world, particularly the rest of the developed world. It's actually quite amazing that Japan is able to interact with the wider world in the way that it does. And there's three real reasons why they're able to do this. I don't want to get into the history too much, but largely what Japan has figured out is, one, they were going to have to adapt into a world that was not akin to what they were used to. Back during before the 1800s, Japan was fine. They didn't have to worry about anything, because the only people they ever had to worry about was the Koreans, or some Asian superpower trying to come in and invade. And of course, they were protected by the kamikaze, the divine wind. Otherwise, it was Japan eventually just getting so strong that they would invade everybody else. What eventually would happen, though, is that you had the Europeans show up. You have the rise of modern economic and geopolitical forces. And Japan realized after the Opium Wars, holy crap, we're about to get killed. So what does Japan do? Well, Japan largely just starts adapting, and they start bringing in technologies from around the world, and industrialists, all these other folks, and they're like, hey, teach us your ways. And while it had a massive historical problem, which we will definitely talk about in the following episode about Japan's historical geopolitical influence and how it goes from basically far off Asian power to juggernaut, economic and military juggernaut, is that was a long process, and it took many different ways, many different steps, until we'll have to talk about the Meiji Restoration, and we'll have to talk about basically everything up to World War II, and then when they get the hard reset after World War II, where they're part of the American sphere of influence. So plenty to talk about there. But in a general sense is that Japan has largely figured out this. They are not going to be an industrial powerhouse because they don't have the ability they don't have the natural resources. But they figured out something really weird. And this is one of the things that actually Japan needs a lot of credit for. Japan is, as you can see here, largely a bunch of islands. It is more or less just a bunch of natural inland harbors, and outside of the few areas that are really good with this geography, that is like the Kanto Plain and the plain around Nagoya in Osaka, is that if you're not really in one of these little insular areas where you can build up that's relatively flat, you're just screwed. So what they have done is that they have, in a place that is largely the size of California, they have largely dumped all 120 million residents into these little exclaves or little geographical enclaves that are able to build up an industrial plant. And then what you do with that is that you import everything you need. And then you export the finished quality. The reason why Japan is such a weird economic case is because by every metric, it plays by all the wrong rules. And there's a reason why in their history they've done the track that they have. Going in before 1800, economically, socially speaking, they're on par with everybody else. Their standard of living is relatively the same for most of Asia, although they feed themselves a little bit better than, like, say, China does. They don't have constant famines, to my knowledge, going through the Chinese islands or the Japanese islands. Very often. Their order's relatively the same, that kind of thing. What eventually happens is you get the rise of the Meiji Restoration and the Empire of Japan, and Japan realizes very quickly they have to metagame the powers against each other because they can't defeat them in an outright fight, and build out an empire of their own for resources, for access, for control, and markets. And they do that very well. You'll have the Sino-Japanese Wars, where the first one is that they'll take Korea and Taiwan, Korea giving them ample access to some resources that they needed. Eventually they'll get into Manchuria and then eventually invade China outright. And of course you get World War II. And for all that it's worth, Japan actually does a pretty good account for themselves. Going into World War II, they're really they're the fifth biggest economy writ large overall. Let me just pull out my numbers real quick because I was actually working on it. Excuse me. I am looking for... So you've got the British Empire, which is, massive because it's got England and it's got India all in the same boat. And so, that's quite the powerful... That is quite the powerful industrial ability by itself. And that's number 2. You've got the United States is obviously number 1, which is just ridiculous because USAOP. You've got the USSR as number 3, and it's just Stalin's 5-year plans is going on. Germany is number 4, but Japan's number 5, believe it or not. Japan is there rivaling, if you will, maybe, okay, more or less Japan is number 5, number 6, and that depends on where you pull China. China, even back then, while being incredibly impoverished by scale, was incredibly powerful. And so it's either number 5 or number 6. The problem is Japan would come in and conquer most of China at one point or another. And so you have to figure out where that ends or begins. But, being still top 6 in the world economically for an island that really shouldn't even have an industrialized economy is no joke. And the Japanese should largely be commended for that. In the regards that what they just basically figured out is that they have to build an empire. They have to secure their access to resources. And what they do is they leave those areas for resource production zones, and then they build them, they harvest them, they tap it out, and they bring it onto the islands themselves, and they manufacture it into finished goods, into refined goods and finished goods that can be sold in-house, and basically, provide a modicum of living for the Japanese people and some level of geopolitical security. Unfortunately, this is one of the bigger things that leads them into the world wars. World War One, they picked the right side because it was really easy to bang German islands with no defense. But eventually they get put on the side of the Axis because, well, the British aren't going to play friends, the Americans aren't going to play friends, the Russians aren't going to play friends, and China just, well, was subjugated largely by them. The problem is that they had to pick up more fights than what they could handle, and not working with the Germans in tandem probably hurt them quite a lot too. Again, more history stuff. I'm sorry I'm turning this into a history episode. What I'm getting here is that Japan just needs quite a bit of accreditation. Now, in the post-war era, is that they largely took that same idea, but because they had now been part of the American network, they could take it and they could amplify it by 100. And so, literally come the 80s, Japan is the second biggest economy, even eclipsing the mighty Soviet Union. And this is Japanophobia from the 1980s, if anyone was old enough to remember that, where Japan buys Madison Square Garden for like triple what it was worth. The reason why all of this happens is that the Japanese develop a new and economic model. Anywhere and everywhere can export resources. So, if it doesn't matter if you're getting it from the Americans, it doesn't matter if you're getting it from Australia, it doesn't matter where you're getting it from. Anyone and everyone can export. So that's part of the American-led world order in opposition to the Soviets. So they now have any and all of the exports that they could want. So, hey, I'll buy massive industrial quantities of this particular good because it's openly shipped and protected by the American Navy. So I'm going to bring it in, and we'll turn it into a refined product, just as similar to what they had operated with during the Empire. The point that made them absolutely wealthy and powerful that they couldn't achieve in the imperial era is that they had a consumer base that they could sell to, largely the Americans, but even after post-war, you get into the Western Europe and some of the developing world to some degree, is that Japanese cars, Honda and Mitsubishi, Toyota, all of these companies become worldwide competitors, particularly getting in the 80s, and then, of course, post-Cold War booms, 90s, 2000s, so that Japan, for even all of its economic woes, is incredibly powerful as an economic and industrial entity because marrying themselves in the United States, or more particularly having the United States just force them into their order, has been incredibly beneficial for Japan because it allows them to focus on being an industrial and service-based economy that doesn't have to worry about extraction services, doesn't have to worry about any of the low-end stuff, and they can highly specialize in being some of the best mechanics and best craftsmen in the world. And it's ironic because literally the former Axis powers kind of have the same going on, particularly Germany and Japan. They are the workshops of the world as far as high quality, high-end industrial and technological goods because they are incredibly gifted at doing that. And it just kind of has become their national ethos and their national ideas, if you will, if you're an EU4 player. They've just kind of taken up the economic administrative ideas, and they've just maxed them all out to where they're now highly technological, highly advanced, highly productive members of the world economy. And so that's kind of nice. But I didn't even get to economics, but demography. Let's get to that real quick and talk about where Japan is because it's not good. Japan is the oldest country in the world, and with 125 million citizens, it's quite sizable, especially considering it's all packed into an area the size of California. But on the other side of that is that it's incredibly old. The average Japanese citizen is 55. Yes, you heard that. 55. It's just one of those deals where they've had shrinking birth rates. They have had an absolute collapse in in what we find as normal for Japan. However, there is something that I have to put out here, and that is almost all Japanese citizens ethnically and culturally identify as Japanese, and where we don't have, I hate to give any kind of ethnocentric talking point, any kind of accreditation, but a lot of the political and social upheaval that we've seen throughout the developing world or the developed world regarding to immigration and all these different culture shocks, Japan largely doesn't have. They just said no. Now, I'll openly put it there. Japan's racist as hell. They just don't let anybody who isn't Japanese well until the end, or at least if they're in, they don't get to stay forever. They're usually on a visa that lasts anywhere between 2 and 5 years, and then you have to get out or you have to renew. But you don't have a lot of crossover in that regard. You don't have a lot of cross-pollination, what have you. So the Japanese people, while being, in the state that they're in, and we can do the Eldar memes here because I love to do the Eldar memes. You're still talking about a nation that has 2.5 million, young people each 5 years. So I'm sorry, about 5 million young people every 5 years that pop out. They're completely able and capable and identify culturally and ethnically as a homogenous group, and so they don't have to fight about a lot of those issues. And that's going to pave quite a way forward, particularly if the world goes to hell again, and we see, major wars kick back up. We see all of these horrible things go off that are ethnocentric, cultural-centric, authoritarian. Japan's really set up to do very well in that regard. Not saying that's what we want, but that's saying that in the world that may go back to the autocrats and maybe go back to a neo-imperial model, Japan's actually in a pretty good spot demographically for handling that, even though they have a significantly lower birth rate. And so putting this in perspective is here. Do they have shrinking birth rates? Yes. Do they have a workforce that is literally about to age in a mass retirement? Yes. But for every con here, there's largely a pro. The con is that they're going to have to figure out how to do economics with literally more retirees than they have active workers. That's going to be a problem. Now, of course, a lot of these people, even in their 80s, will eventually start dying because even with the health of Japan, sooner or later, you die. So a lot of those people that are now in their upper 70s will eventually disappear, but they will largely be supplanted by those that are in their late 40s and early 50s. And of course, that's going to come a generation from now. But when that has finally come, is that you are going to see Japan struggling with how to deal with all of these people that are retiring. But once they do retire, they have lower and lower cohorts of younger people that is going to put absolute hell on their economic system. But we're talking about a nation that, in a general nutshell, no, I don't think Soylent Green's coming. What I do see is this. You're talking about a nation that's already in population decline. They will never have as many key people as they used to have. But you're talking about a country that, is resource dependent, highly wealthy, highly capable. What we've seen, and we'll get into the economics of this, is that even if it's in decline on a macro level, on the micro level, it's doing really well. It's got problems, don't get me wrong, but shrinking might actually be the thing that can save a future Japan, because unlike Germany or another of other countries, is that when you're slowly bleeding off, unlike China, unlike Germany or what have you, is that if you can control that in some kind of controlled decline, is that you can actually improve yourself because you have less people able to do more or the same with less resources. And so Japan is actually decently suited that, even in the post-developed world, which is what we're heading into, where you have shrinking populations and more aging populations of the developed world and of the wealthy countries. They can manage the decline and slide better than anyone can, because they know what the model is, and as long as they have a security guarantor or they know who they have to get what they need, they're fine. Now, there's a lot of that we'll have to talk about again in the history episode, because we have to talk about the future. But in a general sense here, Japan's demography looks rough, but the background of that is actually relatively good, particularly for a country that is, quite honestly, way overpopulated. If anyone's seen Tokyo, you've seen that. It wouldn't hurt the Japanese to have some of their agricultural land back, because they even have to import their food. And so, without further ado, we're going to close out the demography section, and we'll get in the economics, because I know y'all love the economics. Talking about that controlled decline, let's get at it. Okay, so largely what you had in 1970, you had the post-war boom, and all that's starting to go off, and they're starting to get starting to get their traction. And of course, it takes a while, but that growth curve there, that didn't come out right. I'm very sad. I'll have to fix that later. This photo's screwed up. There's no dollar signs. Anyway, here, the green line, you guys know how this works, or at least if you haven't, you do now. The green line is the reported GDP, and it's been a pretty good growth rate all the way up until about 1985, and then all of a sudden it takes off, and that's largely part of the Japan growth era. And of course, that continues all the way up to 95. 95 is where a lot of those people in that first generation of older folks retired en masse, and their economy started stagnating. And since then, you've had a country that has largely been either getting near or on population decline. And so, while they've been able to grow and prosper and shrink repeatedly, and basically have just been in and out of recession since 1995, it's been managed. It's been controlled. And even when you adjust for inflation and all that, between solid monetary policy and solid economic policy, Japan has been able to lock this down in a way that makes Japan look like they can handle this pretty well. Now, of course, it's not over yet. They're only halfway through this. But in a general sense, is that Japan is the first country to really get into a post-developed world. And they are the most equipped to handle it, and they're handling it okay. And then, of course, we'll talk about the standard of living here real quick, which I did have right. At one point, the standard of living there in the mid-90s was absolutely ridiculous, especially adjusting for inflation. With monetary controls, they were doing quite well as well, because they were able to maintain their purchasing power in a very consistent manner. And so, in a general nutshell here, Japan's been doing relatively well. And even since their height of like 1995, even with, purchasing power and everything, either they've been on a very managed decline or they've been able to handle off things in a way that is absolutely, been beneficial and working for them. And I love this chat. Their experts on manga will save their economy. I don't know about that, but it's still pretty good stuff. I largely have been skipping out on the next few ones and hitting this because I don't want to talk about them too much. Japan politics is, while it is nowhere near as vitriolic and as volatile as what we've seen throughout most of the Western world, it's still going through a state of change in its own right. And with the stepping down of Shinzo Abe, it's gotten a little bit fiery lately because people are looking to replace him, and he's left quite a bit of a power vacuum because he was quite the man, quite the force in Japanese politics. And so I don't even know what his replacement's name is, but I don't necessarily know if he's going to stick around for a while. There's a lot of people vying for basically top dog in Japan, and we're not convinced that who has it now is going to stay. So I'm going to table the politics and just say shit fucked, and let's wait a little while to see where it goes. Military, that's the one everyone loves to talk about, so let's talk about the Japanese military. The Japanese self-defense force, as it's so lovingly put, has been largely handicapped since 1945 because basically when Japan was reestablished as a state, it was never allowed to largely have an army. Now, eventually, the Americans kept giving a little bit more responsibility over and over again, just so the Japanese, one, could defend themselves and feel a little bit secure personally, but also so the Americans didn't have to do all the legwork because we weren't getting any money ruling Japan, so Japan could pay for more and more of its stuff. Ever since then, Japan has actually been remilitarizing, rearming slowly but surely. And now that to a lot of degrees, the relationship between Japan and the United States is kind of broken down a little bit, in addition to the fact that Japan has become quite a bit more revitalized in its more national fervor, with most of the people that had lived in World War II now dead or dying or no longer in power, is that a lot of this is kind of coming back to full roost, to where Japan is trying to reassert itself in a region, especially with the Americans not really being nearly as interested as what they probably should be. And so Japan has been slowly eking up the levels of rearming to where they now have aircraft carriers again. And for a while it was amphibious landing ships and helicopter carriers, but now their carriers do have fighter jets. Their navy is, well, not a huge navy. It is entirely a blue water navy that is experienced in practice, and while it hasn't engaged in active combat, openly does drills with the American Navy consistently, and they go full tilt. They're not, random Swedish submarine that, sneaks in during an exercise, because that was a joke, by the way. What literally happens here is that the American Navy does consistently try to maintain its doctrine to the absolute degree that it can with extensive war games, Japan's usually involved in almost every war game in the Pacific that happens with the United States. And so Japan and the United States is largely, although we haven't seen an active naval shooting engagement largely since World War II, they have been done their absolute damnedest to maintain a level of professionalism, security, and competency in naval warfare and doctrine without a proper enemy to face down. And so in the event that somebody actually does do the shooting, it is most likely Japan and the United States are the far and away the most equipped and ready to deal with that. And of course, we're going to have to see how much the technology has really changed the game here, because it could completely derail everybody's plans. But in a general sense here, is that if there's only two navies in the world that I really actually worry about, it's the American Navy and Japanese Navy. The Japanese Army, relatively small. You don't have to worry about it, in a sense, because unless they're deciding they want to invade somebody tomorrow, and that's probably a far-gone conclusion, is that their army only needs to be very limited, very light, largely as a defense to keep somebody else away. But more in a sense, it would be there as kind of like a very high-tech, high-operating force. And quite honestly, I've said it before, the Japanese Army are going to be the first people to build Terminators and Gundams. They're going to be looking for people, or for weapons and robots that are going to be able to replace human labor, so that the humans aren't dying, and that they can basically let their wallet do their fighting for them. And Japan's actually pretty well suited to do that. But also in that regard is that Japanese numbers are just down overall, and so they don't want to recruit as many people, and they'd rather have them in employment to help generate good economic numbers. And so you don't really need a massive land army unless the Japanese are going to go invading Korea tomorrow, which I just don't see happening quite yet. Maybe give it 10 more years, we might have a revisit. But the other one is the Japanese Air Force. Japanese Air Force is superb, and it does pretty well. Now, granted, no one's quite sure of its competency because, unlike the Americans that do quite a bit of work, Japanese haven't engaged in a military armed conflict since World War II. And especially even their Air Force hasn't gotten any actual real practice in active combat operations since then either. So no one's quite sure of their general competency, but at least what we can tell is they've got pretty good weapon systems, and they're willing to pay for the best stuff. They are, in part, the reason why the the F-15EX program got rebooted. The Japanese actually put quite a bit of money behind that program because they're going to buy a few. Which I'm actually surprised the Americans are letting happen to some degree, because the EX is no joke. But it looks like in a general sense is that the Japanese and the Americans, at least for right now, still have very good arms integration. And so if Japan can't simply secure arms from the United States arms industry itself, is that it has a lot that works together to where they can build their own. And if you're looking at almost any of the stuff that Japan operates, it's either American, designed, or it's Western designed that works really well. That's either produced on a license or well equipped. And so you have, I can't remember. I'm thinking it's like Type 90, but I can't remember. The Japanese main battle tank, pretty solid piece of machinery. And it's one of the newer ones out. It might be like the Type 99 or something. I apologize. I confuse Japanese tanks and Chinese tanks because they use the type designation, and they're largely in the same number category. The Japanese largely operate a lot of F-15s, which is the J-15. Kind of the same thing going on with Korea, but Japan takes it up to another level. And so just in a general sense here is what I'm looking at. Japan's military, while limited, is actually quite capable at least by the armament that they have. They drill pretty consistently, which is more than a lot of other people do. They might be pretty well equipped into a world that if it goes to shit, it goes to shit pretty quick. They can deal with that. The only thing they really have to worry about geopolitically going out in the world, and just to wrap up this particular episode, is that if they're going to need resources and global trade breaks down, Japan's going to be in a worry. But if they need to actually go out and make a deal with somebody, they can, because they've got the Navy, they've got they've got the Navy and the professionalism and the credentials to go out there. That if they need to sell 7,000 miles to the Persian Gulf, they can do it, and they can make a deal with whoever is in the middle of a blood knife match to get the oil that they need to import it all the way over, and they are actually in a really good spot to openly deny anybody else who is a rival from doing that, because with the entire Navy being blue water, sure, it's in threat while it's around Japanese home waters, particularly when it gets into the East China Sea. But if they just take the long way around, which, is a little bit more on the use, but if they do, they can absolutely just manhandle anyone and everybody on the blue ocean outside of the Americans. So, in a general sense here, China's going to be their big rival going up, but until China, one, gets the actual weaponry that is of quality, and that's questionable, two, develops the doctrine and ability to fight in any kind of protector's way, because we've talked about them quite a lot. Japan probably, even though it could take some pretty nasty losses, can probably even defeat the massive China by themselves. They'd have to throw the brick, but they could do it. And of course, getting into that one last topic, nukes. Japan doesn't have nukes, but they have a civilian nuclear industry that could very quickly help them get nuclear weapons. Largely in the same way that Taiwan and South Korea could facilitate nuclear weapons within the period of a month, if not shorter. Japan could do the same. And Japan has all the defense industry and whatnot to do everything that they do. You're talking about a nation that within 5 years could have hydrogen bombs if they wanted to. Miniaturized nukes is not something that they could put together. They could put together relatively quickly. Japan, most of East Asia easily could join the nuclear club if they wanted to. The only reason that they don't is because they still feel like the Americans have their back. And that's going to get really questionable in the age of deglobalism and deindustrialization and maybe even in the end of trade to a large degree. And so going forward, Japan has a lot of options. It's got a lot of things it can screw up, but it's got a lot of things going for it. And so I would say the prognosis going forward with Japan, they're in a rough spot, but relatively it's C grade. They could be in a lot worse of a spot. And it just depends on how good the Japanese administration is going forward to how well they handle these coming crises. And so far, not to say they make every right choice, but they do very well overall. Yes, you're absolutely right, Wes, and I largely talked about that back in the demographics. But anyway, they don't have... talked about all that. Sorry you missed it. But anyway, I was hoping that Connor would be joining us for the next thing, but unfortunately not. So we are going to take an hour break before mask off. I hope you guys very much enjoyed this little particular tidbit on in Japan. It has been 42 minutes that we've been. I was agreeing. Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed that. You weren't typing there, so I thought you had stepped away. But yeah, glad that we agreed. And then, of course, if you guys are watching this, if you want my comments on China, just did that last week. Go feel free and look into that if you guys want. Yes, China's looking a lot worse because it's significantly more hauled out, and particularly, while it doesn't look nearly as bad in some regards on the population pyramid, you're talking about many millions of more people that are lesser or more in these categories, and so scale does bring its own problems. Anyway, without further ado, I've been Tyberius D with Geopolitics with Tyberius D. I hope you guys enjoyed Japan, and the next episode we'll be talking about Japanese history. We'll be talking about the old, we'll largely be talking about the Tokugawa shogunate. We'll talk about the arrival of the Europeans and the arrival of basically the Meiji Restoration, Imperial Japan, its process. We'll get into, talk a little bit about World War II. We have an episode, 2.5 hours of World War II content. Go look that up. The big geopolitical fight down. If you want to check that out, absolutely one of my favorite episodes and a lot of people's favorite. And then we'll talk about, the Japan in the era of the Cold War and globalism, where they were just able to rock it off and do incredibly well with themselves. So without further ado, it's been a pleasure. I've been Tiberius D, and we'll catch you guys next time. And if you guys want a certain country you want me to do, let me know, because I've got a list of a bunch of countries, but if you want a specific one, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, all these things, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, all of these, get in contact with me. It's like, hey, would you do this instead? Because I've got no problem with breaking the mold. Anyway, we'll catch you next time, guys.